This is the report that normally is said that I sat on it and did not do anything about it. In fact, our bids, since that report came out, were based at trying to reach the kinds of levels that we need to reach. But I will be explaining that later, how also NSFAS substantially increased but still remained inadequate for our purposes. And after the 2015 fees must fall protest, as we will show later, government provided substantive additional funding. And currently also our work is focused on proposing a funding scheme that will also assist both poor and missing middle students to access higher education and TVET opportunities. Work which we hope will come your way, Judge, at some stage, because it's an important dimension of what the Commission is dealing with. Now, let me go to the first question, after which then I will pause. As to what measures have been taken by government to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the right to further education as contained in Section 29(1) of the Constitution. Section 29(1) of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa says that, and I quote, "Everyone has the right, A, to a basic education, including adult basic education, and B, to further education, which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressively available and accessible," unquote. The department and government generally reads the Constitution to clearly articulate that basic education, including adult education, is a fundamental and basic right that must be provided to all who need it, while further education, which can be interpreted as including higher education, also referred to as university education here, and technical and vocational education and training, TVET, are secondary rights that must be made progressively available and accessible to those who merit it, in other words, who meet the academic requirements. Within the remit of the department, of our department, the provision of community education and training gives effect to Section 29(1)(a), namely that everyone has the right to adult basic education, while the provision of TVET and higher education responds to Section 29(1)(b). In other words, that is why we are building a new layer, a new institution, which is we refer to as community education and training colleges. Sometimes, in short, we refer to it as community colleges, to try and realize the right to adult basic education, to escalate what government has been doing. It is noted that Section 29(1) also refers to the provision of school education by the Department of Basic Education. Specifically, general education and training, which is grades R to 9, which gives effect to Section 29(1)(a, and further education and training, which is grades 10 to 12, which gives effect to Section 29(1)(b). Therefore, to make further education available is interpreted to mean that the system must grow to provide sufficient spaces or opportunities for study. To make it accessible means it should be affordable, and individuals should not be denied access based on financial need, on the basis of a disability or other form of discrimination. Now, what are some of the measures then that government has taken to promote access to further education? Firstly,
Minister, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to understand, would you prefer to do this on a topic-by-topic basis, or do you want to run through all of the topics? Because I think you're moving on to a separate topic now, the next topic.
oh, I thought that this was still part of, sorry, I thought this was still part of 1, which is measures taken by government. And under that we have 1.1, 1.2, and, sorry, and 1.2 goes a long way, right up to, yes, up to page 13 in terms of my document. But I'm happy to stop here, whatever you prefer, which would make it easier to deal with my evidence, Judge. I'm in your hands.
Maybe I could kick off, Minister, by just asking you some questions around the interpretation of the constitutional right. Just to begin the discussion, Minister, in approaching the interpretation of Section 29(1)(b), does government see at any level the need to realize the right to further education for all? So in other words, in the context of progressive realization, at some point, realizing the right to further education for all, or do you interpret the right as being circumscribed to only provide further education to those who can't afford it?
Thank you for the question. The way the government has interpreted this is that progressive realization of free higher education for the poor. That has been how government has actually anchored this policy, because in terms of the levels of inequality in our country, and given our history, or who has been deprived the most of access to further education, it has been the poor.
Yes, well, Minister, that can't be right, because once you've given the poor all the education that they require, then your constitutional right will not cease, because the progression still continues, surely. The progression is there to provide further education. And those who don't have further education will be entitled to have it. They may or may not be poor.
Our interpretation, Judge, thanks for the question, is that maybe it lies in the word progressive. And we have given progressive that interpretation that, firstly, we must actually have those who must not fall out of the system if they are academically deserving or capable. Sure. And that is the poor. Yes. But indeed, that does not stop also for that progressive to also begin to include others who may not fall within the category of the poor as defined by government. Just like the current situation now, the poor has been defined at all those who come from households who earn not more than 122,000. And we've been self-critical of this. Is some of the things that we've begun to look at. This 122,000 has been there for ages. But nevertheless, let me not come to that now. To then say also there are those who do not fall within that category, but who still cannot afford, which then is part of realizing Section 29(1)(b) to say there is this category, what do we do with it, which we have defined as the missing middle. I wish we could get a better phrase for that, by the way. Maybe you will help us, Judge, yes, as the Commission, So that is our interpretation, given the means that are at our disposal and the priorities that actually face our country.
I would suppose, though, that even if you have somebody who falls outside of the missing middle, if it is a particularly large family, it may be that that family is not, doesn't find education easy to come by, and that in due course, as part of the progression, those people will be covered too.
Judge, I fully agree with you. We've begun to look into this. For instance, as we were dealing with, we will come to this, with the 2017 fee adjustments, we're saying, if we say, for instance, we will assist all those whose families, we are not going to charge the fee adjustments all those who earn up to 50,000 rands per month. What if that family has got more than one student? Obviously, those are some of the things that should be looked at. If you ask my own personal view, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yes, of course.
Is that actually no one, irrespective of income, should not be able to go somewhere, say to get a loan, even if I'm earning R1 million per annum, to say, but because I'm building a house or I've got other commitments, I want money to educate my child. There should be a place, ideally, where you should be able to go, at the very least, to make a loan. And of course, also, if you have such a system, you can even consider charging interest on a sliding scale, depending on the incomes of people who are actually accessing those loans. Well, that would be part of the progressive realization of Section 29 1B charge.
And if I may ask you, Minister, we know that the state, through its subsidy system for universities, through either block grant or earmarked grants, that it does fund every student enrolled at a public institution, irrespective of whether that student is rich or poor. It does fund them to a certain extent, to the extent that it either provides block grant funding or earmarked funding to a particular institution. Do you see any nexus between the state funding students indirectly, whether they are rich or poor, and the formulation of Section 29 1B?
Thanks very much, Advocate Pillay. That's a very important issue that we are raising, because it's an issue that normally does not surface. That the block grant and earmark grants, well, block grant generally, earmark grants sometimes may select, but generally they focus in supporting particular areas. Government then funds everybody. There is money that government is paying to fund the running of, say, the universities and colleges, which means that government does fund just beyond the poor, whoever is at university. Because then the question that you are raising helps us to say what we are focusing on here are fees, largely. In other words, the family or student contribution. But there is a relationship. There definitely is a relationship. That is why, as we are talking fees, we have just undertaken as a department, through Mr. Ramaphosa, who is the Deputy President now, before he was Deputy President, a very comprehensive review of the funding formula for universities. Because we realize that you have to deal with the system as a whole in order to be able to address all the problems. We are at the moment modeling that formula as to how it could apply, although some of the recommendations from there, we have started implementing them. E.g., setting aside some funds for historically disadvantaged universities so that they can use those earmarked funds in order to be able to address issues of quality, some other backlogs, and so on. So I'm not so sure, though, whether you wanted me to say anything more than that, but there definitely is a relationship. Because, for instance, it would be of no use to say now further education is accessible to as many people as possible, but they are accessing education into institutions that are falling apart because they are not being adequately funded. It's a very important issue because also it talks to balancing the priorities that we have as government. Let me just make one last example. one unintended consequence of not having, for having paid the fee increase this year for everybody by government, is that we had to take money that we had earmarked for masters and PhD scholarships to actually produce the lecturers that we need. For example, South African academics now average age is 55 years, Judge. If we do nothing about it, over the next 10 years we'll be in big difficulties. So that amount of money was meant for training, especially young South Africans to become academics in our universities. Unfortunately, that money went with fees must fall. But it talks to the point that we are talking about, that much as we may be looking largely at fees here, but we have to look at the system as a whole. It's funding, in other words.
And if I may then turn to a question on fees for the missing middle. We know that the right, at least as it's articulated in the 1996 Constitution, which is the version of 291B, which you see on the screen now, has been in existence since 1996. And yet the first time we see any concrete measure which addresses the missing middle, who we accept cannot afford university fees. The first time we see such a measure is in 2016. So from that perspective, why did it take that length of time to begin addressing the constitutional rights of the missing middle?
I think that really that had to do with the demand and what government saw as a priority. It's a legitimate question that you are asking, but government thought that we need to rapidly expand access for the poor, which in essence is for the very poor, but who are quite academically capable. That would be my explanation as to why it has taken us so long. And also because of inadequate resources. Even the poor, by the way, we're not funding them adequately. What we normally, Judge, refer to as historic debt that students talk about we are owing, and NSFAS students are owing, has been as a result of the fact that there's been top slicing of NSFAS in many of our institutions. Let me give a concrete example. It's just an example. You have a university that says in terms of its projections, we're going to take 1,000 students who will require NSFAS support. But because of the demand for access, the university ends up taking 1,300. Yet, it means then it will have to split money meant for 1,000 students now amongst 1,300 students. Which means then these NSFAS students we are supporting, they're carrying not the full cost of study. They are not being assisted for the full cost of study. And then they start accumulating this other debt, which they are expected to pay, but they cannot pay. That's another problem we've been having for a long time, which we then began to address after the establishment of our department. Because in 2011, DG, if I'm not mistaken, through you, Judge, 2012, we paid this kind of debt for NSFAS students for 2010, 2011. And then this year, we've paid now for 2013, 2014, 2015, and ensure that for 2016, they don't accumulate this new debt. We fund them fully. So that has been the pressure point, really, that the numbers of poor students who qualified for NSFAS have just been so big that we had not really been able to even cover that fully. So it's a question of competing imperatives. But now the reason why I think the issue of the missing middle has become worse, it's because the 122,000 means has been there for a very long time. And that increasingly some of the students really that we categorize as belonging to the missing middle, they are poor students actually. If you come from a family that is earning 150,000 rand per annum, you can't really afford, say, university or even college fees for that matter. So that would be my explanation.